Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another exciting virtual program with the Foss Waterway Seaport and, of course, Pretty Gritty Tours. I'm your tour guide this evening, Chris, and tonight we're exploring the most exciting unsolved mysteries of Commencement Bay. Some we've heard about before with new information, and some we've never talked about before. And honestly, the potential for disaster tonight is very high. We have handled quite a few cursed objects for this, and as you know, if you've known me previously, I really enjoy this season of the year, and I've gone all out. For example, it looks like a laser tag arena in my very small office right now. So the exponential danger of something weird happening tonight is off the charts. But yeah, let's see how it goes. I'm so glad to see you all tonight. I hope you're having a fantastic evening, and I'm looking forward to doing this one. So please, we are, of course, live. If you have questions along the way, let me know. I'll do my best to answer them through the thick fog of mystery that shrouds us all right now. Are you guys ready for this? And now, I will tell you right out the gate, I'm super stoked for tonight because a particular object that I've been on the hunt for probably 6 years now, that I thought, quite honestly, was only rumor, has fallen into the Seaport's possession quite serendipitously. And tonight we get to not only talk about it, but see it. So buckle up for that. Without any, yeah, thank you. I go all out for this. If the fog machine doesn't kill me tonight, it should be a pretty good one. You guys ready? Let's jump on in. Mysteries of Commencement Bay, and there are quite a few. And they're all brought to you tonight by the generous contribution of Tacoma Creates, Columbia Bank, Port of Tacoma, the Foss Waterway Seaport, and of course, the generous contributions of viewers like you. And this is an excellent time to remind you all that this is in preparation. We're doing Wednesdays now, so that you can go take advantage of the free admission, free Thursdays. And anyone can just walk into the Foss Waterway Seaport on Thursdays, take advantage of that free admission. And I'm hoping that this particular thing that I'm super excited about is something that you can see if you go down to the Seaport. I haven't confirmed it yet, but ask. They're pretty agreeable. So if you've been around for a while, you know that I've led several evening tours of the Foss Seaport over the years. And there are just so many incredible and incredibly weird objects throughout that space. This one in particular is one of my favorites. This is a November 2nd, I believe, 1918 photograph. Ooh, that was already weird. Photograph of the Tacoma shipyard. And bear in mind, here's some weird context for you. This was taken at the peak of the Spanish influenza epidemic. And I don't know how well you can see it with that shady lighting on there, but there's just a bunch of people down there at the shipyard all clustered together. And I spent so much of my time wondering to myself, how many of them survived? That should set the tone for tonight. Let's start with an oldie, one that you may have already heard, but I always love telling. If you're not familiar with the Tacoma sea monster, well, here it is. This is from a I believe, just based on this illustration, this was a 1980s news article in the News Tribune talking about an 1893 occurrence where a small group of fishermen were down on the waterfront of Tacoma, and they said that after casting in one of their lines, something ripped the line clean off the pole. When they looked out in the water, what they saw was this giant, they described it as over 100 feet long, barrel around eel with bands all along it, and the face of a bulldog, multiple eyes across its face, and this like electricity charge in the air. And they said that as they approached it, it looked at them with intelligence in its eyes. And shocked so badly two of the fishermen that they passed out entirely, that they were just done. Short-circuited their battery and they were out. And the third fisherman at that time ran away into the woods, fearful for his life, and from the cover of the trees watched as this thing dragged itself back into the water. Now, if you look at the various illustrations of this thing, They range from comical to terrifying to quite grand. And this is of a sea monster that was known to be off the coast of Vancouver Island and Port Townsend, but around that same time period. And they're always described pretty similarly: banded, massive, ocean faring eels that had some sort of electrical current to them, measuring in at anywhere from 100 to 150 feet in length. And what's weird to me about the Salish sea monster is that there are pretty consistent reports of it in the late 1800s to the early 1900s. But I would say about after 1915, they drop off entirely. So was there a sea monster cruising around Puget Sound? Well, probably. Today we have the Kraken, which is pretty similar. Charges people up quite a bit and is described with various levels of authenticity. So we're more or less basically right where we left off all those days ago. But it's worth noting. Yeah, look at the description here. Smooth skin with spots like those of a rattlesnake, but ferocious as a tiger. Whatever the sea serpent was. And like this picture here clearly just looks like a wolf eel, which do frequent the waters around Tacoma, along with a whole variety of other truly disturbing creatures down there at the bottom of the ocean. I don't want to be rude to them, but sometimes they are ugly. So I don't think that any of them have ever been measured in at 150 feet, but two things are pretty well verified. One, fishermen have a tendency to exaggerate, and two, the ocean is dark and deep, my friends, and so there could very easily be a lot down there that we don't know about and haven't seen for a while. So just bear that in mind the next time you go swimming. You never really know what's down there. Isn't that a comforting thought? And no, that's the weird part, right? Nothing. No one has seen anything recently. But yeah, oh man, I wish I had a picture of a wolf eel. You're going to want to Google it. It is ugly. And apparently they're quite sweet and intelligent, but damn, I don't actually know what direction to swipe. I was after the Tinder era. I was going to say something cool, but I lost it. This is what I'm excited about tonight, guys. And this one has been a long time coming. You already know that I am stoked about the story of the Andelana. If you've been on any of my in-person tours or virtual tours, it's like the thing that I talk about the most. And so I'm going to give you guys a quick rundown on the story of the Andelana because it is arguably the weirdest thing that I deal with on a day-to-day basis. But I not only have new information about it, but in particular, something truly macabre and perfect for spooky season to share with you today. So first and foremost, what the heck is the Andelana? Well, I'm glad you asked. The Andelana is the story of a 300-foot iron-hulled British cargo ship that had been sailing all around the world. As it had circumnavigated the globe several times, it had an accomplished crew of talented mariners on board, all pictured here. When they had sailed in 1898, November, out of Shanghai, they arrived here to Tacoma in January of 1899, where 10 members of the crew immediately abandoned ship. They were terrified of remaining on board, and so they got out of Dodge as quickly as possible. And Captain Stalling, who is the front row, second from the left. He looks like he's about 12 years old, but it's worth bearing in mind that captains at that time were hired for their navigation and mathematics ability, not for their time at sea. Captain Stalling, in a last-ditch effort to try and boost morale on the crew and keep these people around, commissions Wilhelm Hester to take a photograph of the crew of the Andelana, which we have today pictured finely here. Yes, it's a terrifying picture. Yes, the dogs meet the same fate. I'm so very sorry. Because on the evening of January 13th, morning of January 14th, we're not entirely certain, the Andelana and everyone who was on board vanished into Commencement Bay. And speculation as to what happened to the ship has run rampant for ages. Did it flip over in the middle of the night? Did it get sucked down by something? Nobody's 100% certain, but I would say perhaps one of the leading authorities on this is our longtime favorite, absolute man's man, maritime diver extraordinaire, Robert Mester, whom you can hear from right now. To this day, the ship, with everyone on board, remains at the bottom of our local waterfront. But what could cause a 300-foot ship that had sailed around the world multiple times to disappear in the blink of an eye? For that answer, we ask local marine salvage expert and master diver, Robert Mester.
The Andelana, you can barely see through the fog, a ship at anchor there. That's about where the Andelana came to anchor. It's straight off the corner dock of our facility here in roughly 180 feet of water. You know, it's not unusual weather coming in from the northwest. Commencement Bay is open to the northwest. The wind brings a lot of waves. This ship, it just came in and offloaded all of its cargo, so it had no ballast. They brought along large logs and changed them to the side of the ship in order to help keep the stability. But, you know, Mother Nature, as we all know, sometimes rears its head and does more than what we expect. And that particular night, the wind got so bad, the ship stability wasn't enough. She rolled enough to
catch water, flip over, and sink to the bottom of Commencement Bay was what he was about to say. And yes, if you're wondering, is it still there? Oh, yes. Not only is it still there, but the story of the Andelana only gets weirder. The ship has never been recovered. And based on when it went down and where it went down, Robert is of the very confident mind that not only would the ship be perfectly preserved in the silt at the bottom of Commencement Bay, but the skeletal remains of the crew, all locked on board, would also be okay. And this is where I started my journey, where I was like, what? Because it was just a cool kind of like ghost story in the area. But the more that I've looked into the Andelana, the weirder and the worse that it's gotten. So this is a copy of the letter that I stumbled across with the help of the Foss Waterway Seaport. It's at a maritime museum in Europe right now. This was written by a guy named Richard Hansa. So front row all the way to the left is Richard Hansa. He's 18. He's gone to sea for the first time. And every day he writes these letters home to his family and draws these jaunty little illustrations of the Andelana, right? And he starts writing home about how he feels like the ship is cursed. And he's telling his family that he keeps having these dreams, these premonitions about drowning on board. And by the time they get to Shanghai, he gets convinced to buy this little talisman. So when you're looking at that photo there, it's about the size of a $50. And he was promised that as long as he kept this on his person, the curse of the ship couldn't affect him, that he would be free from what was described to him as a dark entity pursuing him across the water. They eventually get here to Tacoma, and they have a whole series of problems. One thing that I've been able to piece together is that along that journey across the Pacific, they had a particular sailor on board, this guy named Robert. In a lot of accounts, it's listed as Robert Murdoch, but they don't always have complete manifests of the ship. But Robert Murdoch is accused in the first document I find as having gone mad, and they arrest him. The second account that I've seen is that he abducted this girl while they were in Shanghai and hid her on board the ship. And then they bring her back to Tacoma by accident, and they put Robert in the jailhouse. Terrifying stuff ensues from this point. By most accounts, kind of three things happen all at once, which is the night of the Andelana's disappearance, this Robert guy gets released from his jail cell because it's overcrowded and they want more violent offenders to occupy that space instead of him. He goes out, finds that girl, and murders her. And then the Andelana disappears into Commencement Bay. Weird stuff across the board, right? But it gets even weirder for those of you who are like, nah, ghosts, I'm not into it. Here's some historic weirdness for you. Percy Buck, who is front row all the way to the right, is dear friends with Richard Hansa. He has this toothache, so he begs the captain if he can go ashore that night. And Captain Stalling, who's already reticent to let anyone leave the ship, lets Percy Buck go ashore to go to the hospital and then locks up the remainder of the crew underneath the ship so that they can't escape in the middle of the night and swim ashore. Percy Buck goes to the hospital. They find out he has an abscessed tooth. They pull it out, give him some medication. The next morning, when he's supposed to go back to the Andelana, he discovers that it has sunk into Commencement Bay and the entire crew is drowned on board. Before he left, he was lent some extra clothing by his buddy, Richard Hansa, who didn't want him to get cold in the January chill. And what should he find in the pocket but the very coin that Richard Hansa was promised would keep him safe against all odds on his journey around the world? Weird, right? Super weird. So this magic talisman then gets returned to the Hansa family by Percy Buck after he sails safely home to England. And this is a great question. Why was he locking them up? Captain Stalling was having this recurring problem where the crew was terrified of this undescribed curse on board the Andelana. And so every time he would get to a new port, crew members would abandon the ship. They cancel their contracts, forego payment, and run away from it. And so we know for certain that by the time they were in Shanghai, he was taking up the practice of locking up the hatches so that after the crew went to sleep at night, they wouldn't be able to just pop out and then swim ashore and get away. Which, guys, that's just the summary of the weirdness. Here's where it gets really good, right? So of all the things that we have about the Andelana, there's documentation, letters, insurance documents about this whole thing that really describe in detail the last moments of it. Not to mention the boarding house where Captain Stalling was supposed to go and have dinner that night and had dinner every night that he returned to Tacoma. Seaman's Rest is still located in Old Town Tacoma. This is a private residence today, and it's historically protected. It's on the register, but it is there. And almost every single structure that was important to the last moments of the Andelana has escaped demolition. From Old St. Peter's, the church down there, to Seaman's Rest, all these old structures still remain down there. But without a doubt, the weirdest thing that I ever heard about was this like urban legend that someone at some point had taken one of the greatest disasters in Tacoma, salvaged material from it, and then created a replica, a model of the Andelana. And I was like, what a great story. That'd be so cool. But guess what? It's true. May I present to you the model of the Andelana, hand carved in 1900. This is a scale model of that fated ship that disappeared in Commencement Bay on January of 1899. And what could possibly make this weirder, you think? Well, I'm glad you asked. It is from the streetcar disaster. If you're not familiar with it, let me give you a quick rundown on this. And I want you guys to get to see this in all of its glory too. But basically what happened is that in 1900, the third deadliest streetcar accident in the nation, and the single most deadly one in Tacoma, happened when on 4th of July, this overloaded streetcar, this trolley, was coming over the gulch where the Lynn Bridge is and jumped the tracks because it was overloaded. And the force of it rolling down that hill and breaking apart into pieces essentially just blended everyone who was on board, with very few exceptions. There were a few survivors, but a lot of people, over 40, died on board that streetcar, and several others were injured. Then somebody took a piece of it, a large chunk of that bloody wreckage, and used it to carve a model of the Andelana. I kid you not. See, this is the great debate. Is it the Andelana or the Andelana? Let's go to our source material, because I've seen both, as well as, there she is, the Andelana. This is one of the things. Here we go. So much of the information that I've had to look up on this ship has been, it doesn't match up, right? And so one of the great quests of my life has been trying to just figure out what happened with this whole thing. And I think the person who's come closest to discovering it is Robert. And I'll let him tell you a little bit about it really quick right now, too.
Looking at the Andelana, I did a lot of research into the people, the crew, and it was interesting to find out that a number of the people on the boat had premonitions about being in their room upside down and water rushing in. Pretty bad luck has followed this ship. 2 people died on trying to salvage the vessel, diving on it. And even our efforts to just go out and do a simple sonar side scan pass, we've had troubles with axles breaking and uncooperative weather. I don't really put much belief in bad luck, but there's circumstances behind this that's pretty interesting to look at.
Robert, put some belief in bad luck, man. This is the great debate he and I have all the time. Is the ship cursed? Is it dangerous? Yes, 100%. Stop trying to touch it. I want you guys to get a look at this, though, because this chunk of macabre history arrived recently to the Seaport. I believe it was at the Silica Museum, just hidden in the archives, and then was summoned, like that book with the eye from Hocus Pocus, to us. And it has arrived, and it's delightfully terrifying. So there are quite a few model ships and boats in the Foss Waterway Seaport. I highly recommend you going in to take a look at them. And each of them has a little bit of historic context on it. But nothing matches this. The single greatest land tragedy as far as transportation was this streetcar disaster that occurred. And this is the bottom of the Gulch Bridge where it rolled down. Over the years, people have processed this tragedy in many different ways, but none more bizarrely than taking wood from that accident and carving a replica of the second most dangerous disaster in the area. What's really bizarre to me is that this model of the Andelana was carved by a local sea captain and then given to one of the survivors, a young child who had been on board that trolley and lost their family in the accident. And I haven't been able to find anything to sort of talk to the motivation behind that. What the idea of taking something so tragic and carving something equally tragic and then handing it off to a survivor of that could possibly accomplish. But it remains one of the other mysteries of this entire thing. But the story gets even stranger from here, because it's not just the interconnectivity between these two disasters, but it's the fact that it has remained one of the most deadly locations in Commencement Bay since its original disappearance. And one of the things that makes me say that is that nobody has been able to recover this ship, but a few people have seen it. And over the years, they've sent down a variety of divers. In particular, 2 days after the Andelana disappeared, based on what they thought that it had just flipped over in a strong gust that night, they were like, well, what we could do is send a diver down. He will close up the hatches and then pump it full of air. And then it will float back to the surface, or we can use tugboats to drag it back up. Absolutely no problem. We'll reuse that sucker, right? Well, here's what actually happened. That first diver, Baldwin, ends up, I found this incredible article with the Seaport about the whole thing, getting called down, and he's going to go down and find it. And he does. He sees the Andelana. But to do so, he sets a record of going down 180 feet deep. And at this time, he has to wear a suit like this. So he's got one of those old school hard hat diving helmets, and then his suit is pressurized through a series of valves, and then you can see pumps up on deck, and a multiple man crew has to go and keep his suit pressurized. Well, he goes down, he brings up a piece of the Andelana for confirmation, and then he goes back down. And then they have this terrifying account of him He gets down to 180 feet. He has ringing in his ears. He's suffering from a nosebleed, but he's like, I'm going to do it. Send me back down. While he's down there, the second time, though, one of the leather seals on his pressurizing pump pops, absolutely blows, and he's so far down that there's absolutely nothing to do. His line goes slack and he becomes unresponsive, and they realize that he died at the bottom of Commencement Bay. To make it particularly worse, though, the pressure is so intense at the depth that he's at that he essentially gets sucked inside his diving helmet. And here they have this article about when they pulled it off, his eyes were bulging and skin was blackened and cracked from the intense pressure and suction of being pulled up inside that diving helmet, right? And the rest of him gets crushed. Absolutely not the way to go, in my opinion. But he's not the only one. Over the years, there have been at least 2 other divers who have found the Andelana and recovered a piece of it. And here we have a photograph of one. So this was on display at the Washington State History Museum back when they were doing their exhibit on shipwrecks in the area. I got to talk to some of the security team that's responsible for managing this collection, and all of them unanimously were like, of everything we have, there is something truly disturbing about this particular artifact and piece. None of them liked it. And at least 2 of them were telling me that sometimes they would be like patrolling or closing up at night, and it would look like, if they looked through the glass, that they could see someone standing on the far side of the museum, right? Like they'd look through and it would look like on the other side of the room, they could see someone standing over there, just sort of like the dark outline of them, but looking not through the glass. They didn't see anybody there. And this is like every single piece of this just gets weirder and weirder and worse, right? Not only does the ship disappear with everyone on board, but they have this perfect photograph of it. Then Percy Buck finds himself with the magic talisman that was supposed to have protected the guy who lost it and ends up in his pocket. Then these divers are getting crushed. Someone takes a piece of the streetcar and carves this now, for sure, without any question in my mind, truly haunted and cursed replica of the Andelana, and it just lurks around in the nightmares of Tacoma. So I'm a huge fan of this whole thing, but wait, it gets weirder still. So you remember our guy, Robert, who, not Robert Mester, Robert Murdoch, possibly, who gets arrested for the abduction of this young girl and or goes mad, based on which account you read, gets put into the Tacoma jail and then released when it gets overcrowded. He is on shore the night that the Andelana disappears, and then he vanishes. And most accounts have him committing suicide in Old Town, Tacoma, the night that the Andelana disappears. But just recently, we uncovered this little gem. 80 years after the disappearance of the Andelana, in the 1980s, a woman is on vacation in Acapulco, Mexico, when she encounters a bottle buried in the sand out there. And so, as you do, she takes it, opens it up, and sure enough, inside is a little note written from someone who says they were on board the Andelana, and it's dated 1899, January 14th, 1899. And it reads, "My name is Robert Laughter, and I write this aboard the Andelana. I cast this bottle into the sea for good luck as we come into Commencement Bay and complete our voyage from China. Enclosed is the tooth from a shark for you for good luck, Robert Laughter." Now, not only is that not just truly terrifying, but there is no Robert Laughter. It's almost certainly a pseudonym, a satirical one, but also it's dated the day that the Andelana had already disappeared. So by all accounts, they think that whoever wrote this letter, and it was dated and verified from the time of the Andelana, it's a legit letter, but not to that day. This would have been written by someone possibly on board the ship who had gotten off and then thrown it into the water later. But also, like, I want to give you guys a map here really quick. This sucker drifted from Tacoma, Washington, all the way down the Pacific coast until it got to, marked by the red dot here, Acapulco, Mexico, where it buried itself in the sand and then was gone. They think it had been in the sand for probably 70 years, right? So, yeah, don't touch it. It's not good luck. Get away from it. I'm not into it, guys. I think the story is fantastic, but for sure don't touch this. What I haven't been able to find out is where the letter went. You know, once this woman finds her cursed bottle full of nightmare fuel, where does that end up going? And I have been able to read up a little bit about like kind of what happened to it immediately after. I know that it stayed with her in the family. There's a brilliant account of that shark tooth that they take out of the bottle, oxidizing almost immediately once it was removed from the bottle that had been sealed with beeswax. But no, I think if we have anything to take away from this, it's if your ship is cursed, don't touch it. Leave it where it is, right? Great. I hope we can all agree on that. So, Commencement Bay, you know, it's had quite a share of weirdness to it. I think last year we talked pretty extensively about the fact that there was a whole section of the Tacoma waterfront in the 1890s, 1894, that slipped off during an earthquake in November, and it just dropped off the side of the waterfront altogether. This picture is remarkable because in the sort of top right-hand corner, right under the Foss Waterway Seaport logo, you can see the Northern Pacific Railroad headquarters building there. That's the one on Pacific, right across from Old City Hall. And when this section of waterfront slips off, it takes with it several houses. And a young girl, 14 years old, drowns inside her house in the middle of the night. And the other confirmed fatality is this young night guard who was responsible for watching the payroll of the railroad. And he's the reason that that diver, Baldwin, was down here in the first place, ready to look for the Andelana. So there's just a tremendous amount of lost tragedy down there, including remnants of an old train. So here's a picture of what is now Dune Peninsula Park. Dune Peninsula Park, if you're not familiar, is a slag heap. That entire section there is essentially a blend of trash, lead, and arsenic that during the refining process for copper or lead, the Asarco smelting plant would create all this toxic waste. And they were like, you know what, guys, let's do you a favor. We're going to create a breakwater for the Tacoma Yacht Club. And so that entire peninsula is just molten slag that was dumped into Commencement Bay. And over the years, it got big enough, and they put a little track out on it. And a train used to trolley the slag out there where it would dump it into the water, and then it would cool. And there was a fatality on that too, where one of the guys who was responsible for the project got crushed when the train jumped the tracks. He rolled down and drowned when he was pinned in between the cars down there. Now, a diver who was also in the employment of the city at the time went down and recovered the body, but several parts of that train still remain down there on the bottom of Commencement Bay. Which brings me to one of our other great unsolved mysteries out here, the missing seven. So in the 1970s, seven young college students, a few who were attending a conference up in Seattle, had a friend who was down here in Tacoma. And he was like, you know what? Why don't we go have a good time? We're not doing anything this particular night. Let's all drive down to Tacoma. We can get on my sailboat because I'm a member of the yacht club, and we'll just go around and do an evening sail. And then on the night of Wednesday, April 14th, 1971, all seven of them vanished. And what made it particularly strange is that nothing was ever found of them. Not only did the boat and all 7 of them vanish without any trace, but no part of it has ever been recovered. And what do you know? We have our acclaimed friend, Robert, who can talk to you a little more about it.
We actually went out and looked at a place where, oh boy, in 1994, 1997, sonar survey showed a sailboat off the west coast of Vashon Island, western side. And there was nothing there at the time, but there was a reported incident where a dragger fisherman out of Gig Harbor had drug into something and pulled it over to the shore and got it out of the way for future drags so that they didn't tangle up. And they believe that probably was the sailboat. But once again, the current storms and the time that's gone by probably became dislodged where it was and was moved. I did quite a bit of research actually and contacted some of the relatives. And so many projects just right here in Commencement Bay have come up that I have about more than I'll ever handle in my lifetime. So I haven't continued to pursue that anymore because the idea and location that I had to go and look, we've checked out thoroughly with the museum, I might add, and it turned up nothing there. One of those that we may never find out, but the fact is the boat is still somewhere. Someday, more likely than not, somehow, somewhere, someone will see those remains as technology becomes more sophisticated. The boat remains.
There was so much speculation at the time as to what could have possibly happened to this. And we got a good question here. How deep is the water of Commencement Bay? Great question. It ranges. It goes out, I think like 50 feet on average at a pretty aggressive slope. But at that 50-foot mark, usually there's a shelf, and then it drops down to about 180 feet deep. And then at some points, it can even get down to 600 feet deep. And it's incredibly deep and dark and cold. The water on average is anywhere from 45 to 50 degrees, which becomes lethal very quickly if you're attempting to swim it without some sort of wet and or dry suit. And so people for years were trying to figure out, well, did this group of people, were they draft dodgers? Were they trying to get away? And so they sailed up to Canada and disappeared. And, just a few days after they disappeared, they had really expanded the search to look for them, to see if they had run away and escaped somewhere. If something, nefarious had happened, had they been kidnapped or hijacked? Had they been stranded somewhere and unable to contact someone in the wilds of Puget Sound? Or what everyone really feared, I think, at this point was, did something happen to the boat and it flipped over? But, it's a fairly buoyant vessel. This is a 22-foot fiberglass boat. They all had, personal flotation devices. There should have been something that floated up and was seen and or recovered at some point, but absolutely no trace, no bodies, no flotation devices, no life jackets, nothing, no wreckage from the boat whatsoever has ever been positively identified or found. And it got to the point where they actually brought in Gene Dixon, who in the 1970s was a incredibly famous clairvoyant or psychic for the area, which, heads up, is something that is quite common to the Tacoma area. There have been no shortage of nationally famous clairvoyants who have begun their careers in or around the Tacoma area. But Gene Dixon comes in, and a small group of parents that were attached to some of the missing students there asked her if she could detect anything. And so, yeah, first of all, she saw peace occurring in the year 2000. So I think we can assume that perhaps her radar was not as finely tuned as we want. But she offered to help, but was unable to locate anything, unfortunately. So the missing 7 remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of Commencement Bay. And the fact that no part of it's ever been recovered in any way, and that was 50 years ago, good Lord, seems incredibly remarkable to me, quite honestly. So a tremendous amount of searching has been done all throughout. You can find quite a bit of information about those students. This was Brian Williams, who was the skipper of that particular 22-foot sailboat that night that they went out and disappeared. But nothing has ever been found, and eventually the families just had to determine what closure would look like for them. And the search for mysteries in the area doesn't end there. One of the things, other than the Andelana and its cursed wreckage, which seems to show up again and again in my life, the other great obsession for me is sort of separating fact from fiction as to the tunnels of Tacoma. And some things that we know with certainty: iron grip, historic clad. The city of Tacoma was terraced to accommodate for the incredibly aggressive hill, which you can see in the illustration here, photograph. The way that the city handled that is that they terraced it. So at each point where they got to the uphill portion of a city block, they would essentially cap a section of sidewalk, which they used as a retaining wall, terraform the top there to create a street level, and then boop, 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 create this terrace all the way up on each city block. So when you're underground in a lot of the downtown buildings, you are like 2 stories underground if you're on the uphill side, and you're at daylight level if you're on the downhill side of a building. And what this ends up creating is this whole sort of patchwork network of interconnected vaulted sections. There was also a series of tunnels that was constructed for the use of steam pipe access. And these were because there was a central steam plant down on Dock Street in the early 1900s that provided heat to the entire downtown core. A lot of these historic buildings in Tacoma don't have central boilers or their own heating systems because they were patched into the city grid. And so you can wander through a lot of this vaulted section that's underneath the city of Tacoma and get from one place to the other. And some of it's pretty straightforward, like this vaulted section here, which is underneath essentially where the Swiss used to be on the uphill portion of University of Washington campus. And some of it defies the imagination, like this particular one here. This is probably, I'm trying to think, this is about 3.5 feet wide. And if you went from where the bottom of the water is to the top of the arch, maybe 4 feet to 5 feet tall. And it's one of these strange tunnels. This is underneath the Rhodes building downtown that I haven't been able to figure out. It's definitely part of the historic original structure. It's down there at sort of the like baseline Wilkinson sandstone basalt foundation. But it's filled with water, which is truly bizarre. So trying to go through and look at all these different tunnels and then see which ones were for infrastructure and then which ones ended up getting used for, of course, smuggling is one of my great passions. And a lot of people assume that the tunnels of Tacoma were used for Shanghaiing, right? This practice of getting a sailor super drunk or drugging them, abducting them, and when they wake up with a tremendous hangover, well, do you know, you're out in the Pacific Ocean and your only option is to work on the ship until you get to Shanghai and then have to work your way back. And this practice of Shanghaiing took place throughout parts of the Pacific Northwest. Port Townsend and Portland both have a strong history of this. But in Tacoma, it was the opposite. After the Chinese expulsion of 1885, where the townspeople of Tacoma went down to our Chinatown, rounded up everyone who lived there at gunpoint, forced them on a death march out of the city to a train station in Lakewood, and then essentially killed everyone who resisted and burned Chinatown to the ground, almost immediately it becomes profitable to smuggle Chinese nationals out of Victoria or Vancouver, Canada, into Tacoma. And what should they use for that other than the famed ship, the Portland, also known as the Haitian Republic? And this ship, the Portland, was a steamship that operated in the late 1800s into the early 1900s until it eventually crashes on a reef in Alaska. And there are all these documented accounts of it dropping off cargo of opium usually in fish cans, like tuna fish cans filled with opium, as well as Chinese laborers who would get smuggled in and then used for cheap labor throughout. And a lot of Tacoma still has little dens that bear the telltale marks of this. One of the most talked about is this old bathhouse underneath Pacific Plaza, or where the old spaghetti factory is. This was rediscovered by accident after years of just completely having forgotten about it. Today, it's used as a rain cistern for the rooftop garden of Pacific Plaza, but this is what it looks like. It's underground right now. And this used to be a den of sin, let's call it, where it was a high level of prostitution that would take place in a bathhouse like this underground as part of the like Sandberg mob crime outfit that used to be here. There are places like this, which are abandoned brothels that got turned over in like 1950s or 1960s vice raids and just left exactly as they were. And all of these abandoned places have little clues to them about what used to go on there. And the story of the Portland was the one that I got really interested in, because long story short, what happened is there was a newspaperman here in Tacoma who was like, this is happening. Like this ship, the Portland, is bringing in tremendous amounts of stuff. And the treasury officials at the time, there's a lot of speculation that they were just getting paid off. We're like, I don't think it's actually happening. And because there was no definitive proof, they didn't run anything down on it. And so he creates this insane plan where he goes up to Canada, finds a bunch of smugglers, and then convinces them that this other reporter he works with is a treasury agent. And so these smugglers who want to get out of the game go to the reporter and they're like, hey, we're down a lot of money. We're willing to turn people in if you can promise us safety, get us out of the game. And this other reporter is like, no, you got the wrong guy. I'm not a treasury agent. And so they're like, what are you talking about? They go back, they try and confirm all this information. They talk to some paid off government agents who are like, no, there is an agent in town. And they figure this guy's just messing with him. So they go back and they talk to him and they're like, we want out of the game. And this newspaper reporter agrees. He's like, okay, I will for sure get you out. We'll reimburse your money, but you got to turn over all your associates. But I need proof. Otherwise, I can't do anything about it. So he convinces all these smugglers in the Pacific Northwest to turn in their buddies and to show the receipts for it. And they end up taking out the Portland, which had been smuggling opium and Chinese nationals into the city of Tacoma. And there was talk for a long time that down on Dock Street, where the Seaport is, that they were bringing it in by keeping these low-profile fishing boats under the dock at extreme low tide and then bringing stuff in through a hatch. And when they were remodeling that building, they found this. This is a hatch. You can see on the underside of the Seaport building, on the concrete embankment here, there's a little ladder. And that ladder goes up to a secret hatch in the floor of that building, where here they are demonstrating what it would look like to bring in Canadian or other whiskey and then disperse it throughout the city. But whiskey was only one part of the trade here. Opium and Chinese labor were the other really dominant smuggling things here. And so when they actually found this hatch, which they kept, it doesn't go through the floor anymore, but the hatch itself is still in the Seaport building there, is like, whew, man. And honestly, the story just gets weirder and weirder the more you look into it, because the guy who was responsible for solving this whole thing, after he essentially brings the proof together, they're like, oh, shoot, you're amazing at this. Would you like a job? And then he goes on to work in the government as a customs enforcement officer until he gets accused of some shady dealing and then ends up unaliving himself, death by suicide, late in his career. So it's, you know what this calls for? Dramatic smoke in the studio right now. I think we can all agree that's exactly what's needed in this moment. There it is. You feel a spooky atmosphere now? If you guys don't all have smoke machines in your home, I'd highly recommend it. It really makes the whole thing feel just better across the board. So I want to conclude with perhaps one of the strangest but most iconic stories of the Tacoma area. This one I assume you have to have heard before, but there is some key elements to it that have come to light to me that I think are worth pointing out. And it's the Maury Island incident. If you are not aware, there is a section of Vashon Island, Maury Island, where in the 1940s, 1947 to be specific, I mean, if you want to get real specific, June 21st, 1947, where this gentleman, Mr. Dahl, who was out in Commencement Bay picking up logs that had drifted away from the lumber mill, says that several glowing discs erupt out of the water. One of them looks like it's wounded or broken, and it jettisons molten slag all over his ship, kills his dog, and burns his son. So they get out of there as fast as they can, full throttle back to shore, and he starts telling the story about what he saw. Well, a couple of things worth noting here. A pilot, this guy named Arnold, had seen just a little while before that these glowing sort of sickles flying over Mount Rainier when he was on a little run in his private plane. And he started calling it in to different government agencies. And the U.S. Air Force was newly minted at this point. In 1947, the U.S. Air Force stopped being just a part of the Army and became its independent branch. And eager to prove themselves, especially with this fear that Russia was going to start messing with us, they send some intelligence officers out to confirm Arnold's story. And nothing really comes of it. They start trying to hear things out. And that's when they hear about this guy out here in Tacoma. And this is all taking place before Roswell, right? So the whole Roswell incident is after what happens here in Tacoma. And when these glowing discs come out of the water and shoot their molten metal all over everyone, these two Air Force intelligence officers show up out here in Tacoma and start asking questions. And the story gets particularly bizarre from this point on because they get a bunch of information about what had went on here. They're kind of skeptical of the whole thing, but they're like, you know what? We're going to follow everything up. We want to make sure that we're doing this to the absolute best. And they set up a meeting. They set up a meeting with Dahl in the Hotel Winthrop, which is still downtown. I think I've got my classy picture of it here. Oh, I might not. Just trust me. You can Google it. But the Hotel Winthrop is just across from the Bostwick Cafe. It's still downtown Tacoma today. These two officers show up. They take his testimony. And they're like, we're not sure about it, but because we're going to follow every lead, they end up getting on their plane here, their repurposed B-25, and start flying back to their military base when a mysterious engine failure causes the plane to start going down. So they tell the crew, bail out, but the two officers who were also the pilots up in the cockpit end up dying in this crash. And the wreckage is out on the side of Mount Rainier. Even now, little bits of the debris can still be found out there. But the box of evidence is either completely destroyed or vanishes. So now that the first official death of the U.S. Air Force has taken place while investigating an unidentified flying object off the coast of Tacoma, things get serious. So the FBI gets involved and they start sending a massive investigation of people looking into what could possibly be going on out here. And one part of the story that I think is particularly pop culture cool is that those two officers that originally showed up out here to investigate the whole thing didn't want to create panic cruising around in their military uniforms, asking people questions about weird stuff going on. So they popped in at the Woolworth right downtown in Tacoma before they went to their interview, got some nondescript black suits, And hey presto, they become the origin story of Men in Black. A lot of people start saying that these guys showed up in black suits asking questions about weird stuff going on out there. And that's where that whole thing comes from. Now, for my money, I always try and separate the pieces of this so that it makes more sense. It is worth pointing out that Mr. Dahl, who initially reported that incident out here off Maury Island, had a long track record of saying things like when he was serving overseas in Burma, he was abducted by lizard people that lived at the core of the earth. And they were torturing him for information as they tried to develop a psychokinetic weapon that would destroy the minds of all humanity. Just based on my background as a professional journalist, I would label that, in my professional opinion, as sus. I think there's a lot of testimony from him that needs to be absolutely discounted, but there is a tremendous amount of weirdness that does get brushed under. And the fact that the FBI and the U.S. Air Force all took really keen interest in this event, I think is noteworthy. From a historic standpoint and bragging rights for the area, well, it did happen out here in the Tacoma area, and it happened before Roswell. So we should probably have more tourist information booths promoting it. Again, just my personal opinion out there. Because as we all know, whether we can find it or not, the truth is out there. So for that, I think that's probably enough unsolved mysteries for one night for you guys. I would encourage you to now take advantage of the fact that the Foss Waterway Seaport has free admission tomorrow. Go down to that historic structure because it will be an opportunity for you to not only see the area where that smuggling hatch used to be, but you will also be able to, I hope, get to see that piece of the cursed Andelana streetcar hybrid weirdness. Just absolute weirdness. I can't imagine any situation where someone I knew of, right, was in a horrifying tragedy where they lost their family. And then I went to some other tragedy, took a piece of it, and like fashioned them. I'm just like, oh man, no Hallmark card should ever try and fulfill that role. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. I hope you've had a fantastic evening. If you have questions, comments, please let me know. Or if you're curious where I got this fantastic fog machine, just let me know. I'm always around and happy to answer as many questions as accurately as I possibly can. Until then, get out there, keep on exploring, keep yourselves curious. I'll see you guys very soon. Have a wonderful spooky season.